First, we're going to hear from Marlies Spanjaard. She's the Director of Education Advocacy for the EdLaw Project, which is part of the Youth Advocacy Division of the Committee for Public Counsel Services. EdLaw advocates for the educational rights of Massachusetts' highest risk children. Marlies also serves as an adjunct instructor at Wheelock College in the Juvenile Justice and Youth Advocacy Department. After Marlies, we'll hear from Lisa Thurau. She's the founder and executive director of Strategies for Youth. It's a nonprofit advocacy and training organization dedicated to improving police-youth interactions. Strategies for Youth operates in 38 counties and 18 states. Previously, Lisa served as the managing director of the Juvenile Justice Center of Suffolk Law School, where she focused on public policy advocacy on behalf of court-involved teens. And after that, we'll hear from Cassandra Benzsahi. Did I get your name right?
Yeah, perfect.
She's the coordinator for Massachusetts Against Solitary Confinement, through which she reaches out to communities throughout Massachusetts to assist with social media messaging and other public actions to eliminate solitary confinement as we know it. So let's get started with Marlies.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I wasn't going to do a PowerPoint, but then as I started to think about what I wanted to say, there's a lot of alphabet soup in what I want to say, and so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to create a PowerPoint, and it'll be there in the background. I don't plan to read it, but we'll use it as kind of a backdrop. So as Phil mentioned, I'm the director of the EdLaw Project. I'm also the executive director of the Youth Advocacy Foundation. And the Youth Advocacy Foundation is basically a 501c3 nonprofit arm of the Youth Advocacy Division of the Committee for Public Counsel Services. See what I mean? There's already a lot of this, part of this, part of this. So what that means is we essentially are a nonprofit arm housed within the State Public Defender Agency, and we are charged with providing services that aren't funded by the state. And our main initiative is the EdLaw Project, and we provide education advocacy for the state's most vulnerable kids. Oh, that didn't show up exactly right. It looked better on my computer. This is a Mac PC issue, maybe. But our idea is that looking at the rates of education issues of kids that are court involved, and I'm going to go through a little bit of that. The idea is if we can get kids on track educationally, then they're less likely to be court involved. Kids that are experiencing education success are not often the kids that you see in the courthouse. And if we can intervene and help them to receive some educational success, then they're less likely to continue in the juvenile court system into the adult court system. The reality is we are failing our kids. There are estimates that as many as 85% of kids involved in the juvenile court are functionally illiterate. If we look at our proficiency rates, we are not doing a great job for kids in the state of Massachusetts. So Massachusetts is like touted as we've got the best public school systems in the country, and we do have a lot of fantastic school systems. But we're not serving everybody equally. And the reality is that we have some incredible disparities when it comes both to who's in the juvenile justice system as well as their educational outcomes. And I think one of the most alarming statistics is that there is a statistic that says that approximately 2/3 of kids that are not reading proficiently by the end of 4th grade will end up in jail or on welfare. And that is an astounding statistic, and that is what we are trying to address. And when I say court-involved kids, you know, I think if you say that to the general person, a lot of people think about delinquency or criminal contact, but I want to be very clear that we are also talking about kids involved in the foster care system, and they also have unfortunate outcomes when it comes to education. Every move in foster care, there was some conversation a minute ago about kind of permanency. in the foster care system, but every move in foster care costs kids about 6 months. They fall back about 6 months in their education. The graduation rates for kids in foster care, only about 30% of kids in foster care are graduating from high school, and less than 3% are going on to get a bachelor's degree in college. When we talk also about school exclusion, and when I say exclusion, I mean that broadly for suspension, expulsion, anytime a school says, you are not welcome to return. Students that are excluded are much more likely to drop out of school. And who we are excluding, again, there are some incredible disparities here by race and also by disability. Kids with emotional disabilities in particular are more likely to be excluded. They're more likely also to be arrested. The arrest rates in Massachusetts out of school, the schools with the highest rates of arrests are the therapeutic and alternative schools. So we diagnose and we label kids with emotional disabilities in school, and then we sometimes send them to schools specifically to address their emotional disabilities. And those are the schools that are then arresting and sending the kids to into the court system. So that is also a huge problem. In Massachusetts, the highest rate of exclusion, if you are looking for the category, because there's racial issues, there's also disability issues, but if you combine them, then you have an even higher number. So in Massachusetts, if you are a young black male with a disability, you have the highest likelihood of being excluded. And it's economically devastating. So it's not only that this is problematic on an individual level of how we are treating individual kids and large groups of kids, but we are also spending an incredible amount of money to incarcerate kids, that if we put some of that money towards educating them and getting them what they need early on, then we wouldn't see the same kind of impact. If you think about, there's both the devastating cost. There's estimates that if a child grows up to be involved in the criminal justice system, that it costs taxpayers $2 to $4 million per one child. Whereas if we can get that child on track educationally, then we can look at ensuring that they graduate from high school is $250,000 of lifetime earnings. So even if you're not someone that cares specifically about the kids, which I'm hoping you are, there's also the devastating economic impact. So also thinking about kind of what we are doing to address this. So part of what I love about this conference is that it is bringing people looking at different avenues of how to address this issue. It's a complicated issue, and there isn't one answer. So, I think everybody trying to do their piece from where they're sitting is a great way to kind of attack some of the problems. So what we are trying to do with our EdLaw project is to provide expert legal advocacy for kids involved in the juvenile court system. So whether that's through a delinquency or through a CRA or a child requiring assistance, so that's a status offense, whether they're not listening to their parents or not going to school, or through a care and protection where there's an allegation of abuse and neglect against their parent, to help those kids specifically to get on track educationally. And we are doing that in a number of different ways. So the EdLaw project has been around about 18 years, and for the bulk of that time, we were very small, 2 to 3 attorneys, providing education advocacy mostly for kids in Boston who were either court involved or at risk of court involvement. So we still do some direct representation of children. We do a lot of training of parents and youth workers. We have a pro bono panel of area law firm attorneys that get involved as well. But our main push right now is we are uniquely positioned because of our position in the public defender's office that we have access to all of the attorneys that are already working with these very vulnerable kids. So there's 5 of us right now, 5 attorneys. We have a staff of 6 in total. And there are 1,000 attorneys across the state working with children in these 3 areas, in the delinquency, care and protection, and CRA. And so we are taking the expertise that we've learned through doing the direct representation, and we are training and supporting those 1,000 attorneys to do education advocacy as part of their practice. We believe strongly that you cannot effectively represent children if you are not getting involved in what's going on at school and helping the children experience some educational success. So we are taking our small group and we are training and supporting the 1,000 attorneys with the idea that through that we can reach 25,000 children that are in the system on a given day. So our theory is if each lawyer even does education advocacy for just one child, 1,000 kids can be positively impacted. This is not a quick fix. This is not a, we did a training and now they know everything and they're going to go and solve all of these issues. These are complicated issues, but we are taking our expertise and leveraging a resource that already exists, a resource full of expert child advocates in these other areas that can already have the relationship with children as well. So we're building on the relationship they already have, the trust that they already have with the child, to get involved, to do the education advocacy. The other idea here is that it's easy to ignore for a school district to handle and maybe address one situation if an attorney gets involved. But if you look at some of the statistics, it's 40% of the schools that are responsible, it's 5% of the schools that are responsible for over 40% of the exclusions, the suspensions and expulsions. So there are some real target schools and real problem schools. And those are the schools that are then bringing the kids into the juvenile court system. So we're bringing the advocates right back to the school to say, no longer business as usual. This is no longer how we're going to address these situations. We're going to address them through appropriate school services and educational support and not through the juvenile court system. So that's what we're trying to do. Is this you? This is you, right?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to come after Sana and Marlies, who do great work in this state. My name is Lisa Thurau, and I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for the Mental Health Legal Advisors Committee and the Houston Institute, groups I've worked with for a long time. And I'm going to try and speak quickly in 15 minutes about the issue of law enforcement interactions with youth, but it's going to be impossible. So we're a national nonprofit policy and training organization equipping officers with best practices for working with youth, and our goal is to reduce disproportionate minority contact. And we use a couple of strategies. One is we train law enforcement, or try. We do a lot of outreach to youth, including a juvenile justice Jeopardy game that we're now developing to focus on issues of trauma. We do policy development for law enforcement agencies, because you will be astonished at how many law enforcement agencies have no policies to deal with youth and none to deal with youth with mental health issues. And finally, we do original policy and research, some of the results of which I'll show you now, to try and address the structural issues that seem to constantly enervate us and not show any change. So I'd like to start at 30,000 feet and then go down. How are officers prepared to work with youth in America? Anyone want to guess how much training they get to work with youth? Okay, thank you very much. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police did a study of how much in-service training they get, because there are 2 points at which officers can be trained, and that's at the academy level before they become sworn officers and after they've become sworn officers. And the amount of training they get after they're sworn officers is bupkis, a legal term, but we're trying to change that. And we at Strategies for Youth looked, well, if they're not getting any training after they become officers, what are they getting in the academy? Surely that must make up for the deficits afterwards. In fact, no. The average amount of time spent learning about youth issues in the academy is 6 hours, which exists on a continuum from 0 to 10. And the topics are predominantly juvenile code and law. And some of this may not be accurate because we couldn't get every state to give us its curriculum. 9 claim they focus on the mental health of youth, which is important because adolescence is when most mental health issues start cropping up, right? Not to mention just the difficulty of being an adolescent. There are genetic predispositions that start rearing their head. And all states are required to address disproportionate minority contact under the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, but only 8 states in 2013, when we analyzed this, were even mentioning it in their trainings. And now, under President Trump and former Attorney General Sessions, there's been a complete dismantling of obligations of the states to address DMC. So, officers are not trained to have some basic skills here. They don't understand brain development and how it changes. They don't understand what we call developmental competence, which is understanding that people at different ages are at different levels of development and therefore have different capacities. And we as adults interacting with youth, for instance, need to adjust our individual and agency and structural responses to them. They are not trained in implicit bias, or some departments are. It's hit or miss. And they are not relating it necessarily to their own practices with youth. They're not trained in mental health for youth. Some get CIT training, but CIT for adolescents is rare. And there's no unifying theory of mental health issues in CIT trainings often. They're not looking at alternatives to arrest, and they're not being trained in what community resources exist as alternatives to arrest. So what policies guide officers? Because surely, if there's no training, there are policies. You see a theme? Well, when we analyzed this, we found that at state levels, there are no standards, there are no statutes, there are no regulations. Individual departments develop policies and practices, or they use national police standard-setting organizations' policies, which aren't always updated and don't reflect things like the U.S. Supreme Court decisions, which we think are good to consider, because they might, well. And they have no legal obligation to update or upgrade this or even reflect federal or state law decisions. And we routinely go to law enforcement agencies and ask them if they've heard of the decision of JDB versus North Carolina. For those of you who are police, juvenile defense attorneys, you know that that's kind of important. It's about when you're in custody and when you should Mirandize kids, and they haven't heard of it. So I'm not blaming individual officers here. I'm blaming the leadership and the structure of law enforcement and the lack of advocacy and the lack of political will. But there are other things I could blame too. I'll go to those later. So the yellow represents where there's not an iota of regulation or oversight in America today. And I want you to know that I've just come back from a Midwestern state, a farming community, very poor, where we just conducted 2 days of training. And these are all white kids there. And what we saw there was an absolute abject failure to recognize mental health issues. Specifically, they don't understand traumatic responses, and they don't recognize or understand autism, although that's changed for the better. And as a result, you typically see escalation of interactions with youth with mental health issues. Many officers perceive any kind of dysregulation or acting out as defiance, and they have no training for de-escalation to help kids self-regulate. And many of them still perceive incarceration as a fix. You compound that with race and class. You see that youth of color, YOC, are not understood to have mental health issues, that they are even, officers are even less aware of how simply your status in America as a person of color or as an immigrant or an LGBTQ person is going to contribute to some of your mental health issues or your reactions to law and authority figures, and they're just not aware of trauma. It is a shock to them to hear of transgenerational transmission of trauma. and how this really connects with race for African Americans. And so it's not surprising that arrest is the greatest source of disparity. Relative rate indexes, for instance, of Massachusetts speak volumes about that. In Massachusetts, for every white kid arrested and incarcerated, there are 10 black kids. There are 7.5 Latino kids. So what I wanted to do with Strategies for Youth is start at the beginning and try and stop the officers as gatekeepers from allowing in or ushering in so many youth simply because they didn't understand what the youth's behavior was communicating. And this is particularly difficult in some situations when you look at where police are deployed. As Marlies said, there are some school systems where police are the major tool of order. And as Martin Luther King said, when you prize order over justice, you're not going to have either. And as a result, youth of color and poor youth are disproportionately experiencing exclusionary discipline practices. So for many youth, and you'll see most of my pictures are of African American boys. It's very hard to find pictures of African American girls or even Latino kids, and yet they are terribly affected by policing policies too, and school discipline policies. But as Professor Carla Shedd has said, interactions with police are a developmental milestone for boys of color, and it can start very, very young. So I want to have you consider how law enforcement is both in need of change so that it recognizes and develops the capacity to see mental health issues when it confronts them and not escalate them, which they're often quite good at, and at the same time have law enforcement realize that they are a source of many mental health issues. As a gentleman before spoke, the state can be a great source of trauma, and they don't seem to recognize it. So I thought I'd explain to you how I understand why police treat youth of color differently. And the primary reason, in my view, is that they view youth as dangerous. Now, this is a photo of a child, an African-American boy, wearing a soldier's helmet. And I use this because it's an ambiguous picture for many officers, which is many of them don't believe that they have experienced conditions, including foisted on them sometimes by law enforcement, not always, but sometimes, that makes them need that protection. And in other cases, officers believe that they can handle this, they're strong enough. So the most common views we hear from officers about youth of color and why they don't deserve special treatment is that they're older, they're savvy, they know how the system works, which is unbearably untrue. They're used to police in their lives, and they're good at malingering and pretending to be mentally ill. So when we do our In the Presence of Children training about police coming into homes and serving warrants or arresting parents, I have had officers come up to me and say, I never thought that it would be traumatic to see your parent arrested. So officer perceptions are that youth of color require more force, and that's the only thing they'll understand. And they require more coercion because they surely couldn't be telling the truth, and they are therefore entitled to less empathy. So I'd like to show this quick video of Dr. Richard Dudley. His full article is on our website, and if you, I don't know what to do here. It's going to show. If you could take a look at it, I think you'd find this article brilliant because he makes the case that all systems must be trauma-informed when dealing with children. He's the former Deputy Commissioner of Mental Health for the City of New York and just a brilliant scholar and thinker. There we go, thanks. Okay. Thank you.
Are exposed to multiple cases. We asked Dr. Richard Dudley to explain how trauma affects children and youth.
The trauma-related symptoms, the overreactivity. These are the kids who seemingly seem to snap for no reason. You know, they're irritable, they overreact, they see danger when it's not really there. The slightest little thing will push their button, and they'll overreact to this perceived threat. And an adult who thinks, well, I can simply stop that by being more threatening, you know, only escalates the problem instead of, you know, calming it down. You know, that sort of show of strength, and missing the fact that that this is a kid with a trauma history, and he's simply afraid. An adult who has some sort of recognition of that, and that they've seen or learned that this child or adolescent has this sort of trauma history, then they can deal with them in a different sort of way that's not threatening, that doesn't provoke this sort of behavior. You know, an adult who comes in a more threatening sort of way, of course, will. And if they still fail to recognize that that's what's going on with this child or with this adolescent, then they're just kind of in a spiral where they're both provoking each other. You know, that the more the kid overreacts, the more the adult decides I need to be more threatening, and it just becomes this sort of spiral that can spiral out of control. And then for boys of color, you add to that the fact that their pain is devalued also because they're boys of color, not just because they're boys. And so it's kind of a double whammy that they're dealing with, and recognizing that they have been traumatized in some sort of real way, and that can affect their behavior is something that's very difficult for people to kind of grasp and understand. And so you have, as a result, you know, the kinds of notions that, you know, if you had a kid who was exposed to X, that we could see that would be harmful. You have a black kid that's exposed to X, and we describe it in a totally different sorts of way. We say that, he's grown up in a tough neighborhood, so of course he's tough, and he's learned how to be violent because that's the way they are, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, it's a totally different sort of formulation of how you take an exposure to a violent act that you may have given to a different sort of kid. Other research that looks at race and how people see, adolescents of color helps us to further understand that. So for example, the studies that look at, the estimates, even of police officers, the estimates of how old kids are, and that, similar age kids, white kids, black kids, the black kids will always be perceived as 4 or 5 years older than the white kids. Well, that has a big implication when you're dealing with kids on the street, right? Because the older looking kids you expect something different from. If you're talking about a kid who's 14 and you think he's 18, you expect something different, and you hold him more accountable. You think he's older and he should know better, and that sort of thing. So you're not even looking at that kid as a young adolescent anymore who has the problems of young adolescents, just because of the fact that you've misperceived him as being so much older. So the kind of the most obvious one is that when you interview these kids, and you see it like in police tapes, when you look at police interrogations of kids and stuff like that, the African American adolescents are kind of sitting there as if this is no big thing. It doesn't even bother me. They're looking like they don't care, and it's interpreted as a lack of remorse. And they don't. It's striking that it's not understood as a way to control how anxious and frightened I really am. Because that's really what it is. And when you're doing an evaluation, you see that, right? When I'm actually meeting with these kids and talking to them, and you lift that defense, then they start crying and everything else kind of comes out. And so it's hard for me to imagine a seasoned professional not appreciating that as just kind of the way that kids are going to manage how frightened and how anxious they really are.
So I know I'm going a little bit over my time. I'll go quickly. Can you help me get back into my... I think Dr. Dudley has said very succinctly what we see across law enforcement agencies in America and what I like to call arresting distress. So if Matt's parents have fought the night before and his father is arrested and Matt goes to school the next day and acts out in class, there's no investigation because police departments can but refuse to try and connect information from one part of their department to youth responses in another. I hear police officers doing it surreptitiously so they won't get in trouble because we don't want them to arrest distress, right? It should be minimized, no? It's there, thanks. So you see officers responding to kids in a way as treating them as sources of danger first and foremost, and they're going to control with force and assume competence because they assume youth are older. And meanwhile, on the other side, kids are scared out of their minds. And it's not just young people who are scared, it's their entire families. And when you think of the ripple effects on families of what this fear does, it's very disturbing. Officers don't recognize their historic role in oppression or do and exploit it sometimes, but I'm happy to see changes towards avoiding that. They see traumatic responses as guilt. So fleeing must mean you're guilty, right? Not that you're scared to death, right? And they don't believe their own conduct causes trauma. So our responses to that are training. And training is necessary but not sufficient. So we do policing the teen brain for patrol officers. And up here, I have a bunch of the information we hand out during trainings. Our trainings always start with presentation by a psychologist who is expert in adolescent development and mental health issues of youth adolescents. We do policing the teen brain in school for school resource officers and administrators and campus guards and all the other armed people there. And policing the teen brain in transit, which we started with the MBTA Transit Police in 2004, as well as in the presence of children, which aims to mitigate the trauma children experience when they're watching a loved one be arrested. Our trainings typically spend the whole first day on understanding normative adolescent development. And when you see how reactive, thoughtless, impetuous, impulsive, brilliant, crazy, boundary testing youth are, when they're normal, then it's gives you some thought about what's going to happen when they're experiencing a mental health issue or when simply they are living in America's poverty-stricken cities, towns, villages. And finally, we talk about trauma a lot because officers aren't even aware of their trauma. So when we train SROs, we train them a lot on emotional disabilities. And I urge all of you here to pick up our parents' checklist. This was built by us when we saw what happened in South Carolina. We want every parent, and we think every advocate should be able to find out what's happening in their district schools to kids and what information is public about special ed, about use of force, use of restraints. Our trainings rely on the premise that using an adult approach with youth is harmful, and that if you have some basic knowledge, some basic developmental competence, you will treat youth differently and you'll have better outcomes and you will arrest distress less. And we urge officers to stop using law enforcement responses for things that are not legal or criminal issues. These ought to be referred to community-based resources, but few law enforcement agencies have any kind of partnership with those organizations. Finally, here are some of the things we hand out. I'd be happy to give you some there. And policies are necessary to accompany training, okay? If you don't have policies, then there are no grounds to evaluate wrongdoing by the officers. They must reflect training, and training must align with policies. And you must have partnerships with YSC, youth and community-based organizations. As you can tell, I could go on at length, but you'll find a lot of resources on our website, strategiesforyouth.org. And please pick up one of these and see how well your school is disclosing what it thinks it can and can't do to kids. Thank you.
That's great. Hello, everybody. So, speaking at Harvard again. My name is Cassandra Benzsahi, and I am the coordinator for Massachusetts Against Solitary Confinement. It's really good to be here today, and I've heard some great stuff. Just listening to Dr. Dudley just now, I have to say that what it means to be the coordinator for Massachusetts Against Solitary Confinement, I have to applaud the organizations that reached out and decided that they needed help to work on solitary confinement. But they chose a person who was affected by the issues that they were working to reform. I am a member of the post-incarcerated community. I haven't done time in solitary, but I have done time in the state penitentiary and state prison for women. I know what it's like to lose your freedom. I've worked as a coordinator, an organizer, and activist for over 10 years. I've built a lot of relationships with legislators, people in the community. A lot of my family members are affected. I know about the collateral damage that prison does to people. So I use those relationships to come at this work from a different angle than a lot of the professionals that do this work come at it, you know? I bring that personal lens, I bring those stories, I bring the people that I know to the table. I was listening to Dr. Dudley, and I was thinking about the racial disparities of this work and how it hits me, you know, right in my heart, because I know so many people that are affected by it. And previously, I was doing some work canvassing for ACLU on the side on what a difference a DA makes. The campaign was called What a Damn. And we were hiring people that were affected by the criminal legal system to do the work because they would be passionate about it. And a few of the people that I hired at $15 an hour had done a lot of time in solitary. One of the young men that I'll never forget was in my car, and we had to take a long ride out to one of the communities that was waiting. There was only 6 communities that had district attorney races out of all of Massachusetts. So we drove out to Brockton, and he was so traumatized from solitary he couldn't put his seatbelt on because it made him feel confined. And one of the girls that sat in the back insisted that he put his seatbelt on, so we were taking it lightly, and he put his seatbelt on. He broke out in a cold sweat, and later on he started throwing up. I mean, solitary confinement, it's one of those things that, you know, people, it may be necessary to contain the worst of the worst, the Hannibal Lecters, or the people to keep the general population safe. But we come at it from an angle that there's a lot of misuse and overuse of solitary. So my role in the coalition that we call MASK is to talk about how solitary confinement it's the practice of isolating a prisoner in a cell for 23 hours a day. Everything that you've heard here, it goes on. MASK seeks to end long-term solitary in Massachusetts. We are fighting for reforms. We lift up best practices. We know that Maine is among one of the places with the lowest reforms in solitary. We see that Virginia has almost done away with solitary by training their officers to work positively with the people inside. We know that there's a better way. Reforms will, in the long run, improve the conditions and improve the human beings that we hold inside. Solitary is expensive to taxpayers, and it allows people to just overuse their power. So with Massachusetts being one of only 3 states that hold people for up to 10 years, All of the new criminal justice reforms that have gone in place in 2018 are so necessary. The data that wasn't available that Liz talked about. Part of that criminal justice reform is creating an oversight committee. Some of our members from Prison Legal Services, they're part of the coalition. Some community members, some people that are going to address mental health issues are going to be on that board. The people inside of solitary who haven't had a voice except for to reach out to attorneys when they could be, and we know there's not enough attorneys to go around, they're now going to be able to voice some of those discretions and things that are going wrong. For people to be placed in solitary before they even have been accused of anything or be held there for years before they've had a trial, it's just not fair. So the psychological effects, they're long-lasting. The racial disparities of the system that we know, some people are in jail that shouldn't be there. And just to think of the problems that they have once they get there. So all of that compounded tells us that we need to deal with this. This problem has been undervalued. No one wants to look at it. No one talks about it. So we're very excited about these reforms that we have coming up. They'll go into effect in January. MASK does an action on the 23rd of each month to shine a light on the 23 hours a day that people are held in solitary. One of the last actions, and I always talk about it because it was the one that had the most impact for me, we were on the Boston Common, and we stopped passerbys, and we had one of those virtual reality goggles that people usually do the roller coaster rides in, but we had a solitary cell in the goggles. And there were so many people that were afraid to even put the goggles on to place themselves in that cell. Imagine how people feel when they have to be placed there, especially if they have mental illness or those layers of trauma that they've gone through, or they're pregnant, or they're youth, or they're placed there just because they're LGBTQ and they say they're there for their own protection. We don't feel people should be punished to be protected. You know, solitary confinement doesn't keep our prisons safe. It doesn't cut down on violence. On the contrary, it probably creates it. When Liz talked about the public safety issue, and we know that over 80% of people are coming out of prison, sometimes released within 30 days to the community from solitary. Those are our neighbors, and they're damaged. That's a public safety issue that we should really be concerned about. In the absence of explicit policies to meet the needs of these people, we are creating a community that we don't want in our community. So we really have to work on this trauma. We have to work on these reforms. We have to work together. We have worked on a website, which is not up yet, but it's coming. We do have a Facebook page, and it's called MA Against Solitary. We have a Twitter page that says MA Against Solitary, and we tweet out at Stop MA Solitary. We put a lot of stories on there, a lot of information. This is a movement all across the country, so we're kind of getting swept up in the whirlwind, because when that happens, you can make change. There is a campaign that started, I think it's called Open the Box, but it's through the ACLU out of Washington, and they want to end long-term solitary to no longer than 15 days for children, those that are mentally ill, and the vulnerable population. So that's a national campaign. There have been changes, there are best practices, and we're asking Massachusetts to look at those best practices, lift them up, see how we can do better. since we're being so progressive, we might as well work on some of the worst of our issues, you know? We can be upfront with that. I think that we need to collect our data. We need to make sure that we're not sending our young people in juvenile detention to solitary confinement. We have to deal with our issues. We can't just, it's like bad parenting, you know, sending your kids to their room and not dealing with it, not talking to them. You can't just hide them in a closet. We have to deal with people. So I think that our work is cut out for us. I'm glad that I'm on board. And again, I say that this coalition, it's a group of nonprofit attorneys, faith-based organizations have come together, and they've chosen me, they've chosen people that are affected, that really know what this practice has done, so that we come at it with everything we have, because we know that people inside are depending on us to make a change. Sometimes that's all they have, is hope that somebody is fighting for them, that somebody's going to make a change and not going to forget about them. So that's what we do. Thank you for listening.
So we've, in a minute, we're going to break down, ask you to arrange your chairs, so in groups of 6 or 8, and then, try to address the historic question, what is to be done? You've heard from people working in communities and doing mass representation and working with the people who are oppressing those that need the mass representation. But before we break down in that fashion, I think we can take, say, 10 minutes to ask questions of this panel. People who want to ask questions can line up at the microphones. And just to get us started, can the panelists comment perhaps on what you've talked a little bit about the underlying theory of your strategies, and I think that's been pretty clear to the folks that are listening. But can you talk a little bit about how you see the efficacy of your of what you're doing, how your own appraisals of what it means, say, to represent a kid in school? What's the impact of it? To make the community more aware of the issues around solitary confinement, or to train cops.
Was that question directed to me?
It's to all of y'all. How do you see? What impact are you seeing? You've been working at this stuff for a while. What do you see?
I'll go first, because then Marlies has to deal with it when our efforts failed. So we have seen tremendous willingness to adopt our ideas by law enforcement, and this is the most shocking and reassuring part of our work right now. And so where we see the biggest declines in juvenile arrests is in schools, when we do our Policing the Teen Brain in School training. In Spokane, we saw an 84% decrease. In Omaha, a 55% decrease, with the police department telling the school administrators they refuse to return to the school unless administrators stop sending kids over for stupid reasons to be arrested. We see lower levels of success with patrol officers. That's about 30 to 35%. But my theory is, when you reduce arrests of youth, because the arrests are so disproportionately skewed towards youth of color, you're immediately seeing an improvement in who gets arrested. And this has been demonstrated in those cities and counties that give us pre and post data. But one of the things that makes me happiest is that officers say they feel better about themselves because they're ashamed sometimes about what they do, and they're glad they have these tools and wish they'd had them earlier. So now we're inserting ourselves into recruit academies. Oh, that's a story.
Can you tell it?
I can just say my answer is short. The improvement that I see is that people are listening and that we did get a piece of the criminal justice reform bill so that we have the oversight committee, so we have some reforms coming up for solitary. And I think more reforms, would you say, Liz, than we've ever gotten before. And we've been fighting, PLS has been fighting for a long time for solitary reforms. So we're looking forward to holding them accountable and monitoring the work they're doing. You know, we just got those reports that Liz showed on the PowerPoint, showing the numbers that clearly show that Massachusetts is going in the wrong direction. And we're hoping that the data is going to help us to find out what we can do to turn it around.
So I have a lot of anecdotes about, you know, people calling and getting the advice and support and then going and doing that work. We've had, just in the last couple of weeks, we've had a number of delinquency and child welfare attorneys actually filing at the Bureau of Special Education Appeals for appropriate special education services, which is exciting to see. I was looking at the numbers this morning because I thought I might get a question like this. Just in the last year, we've had about a 15% increase in the amount of attorneys calling us for support. So that's been exciting. We're in the process of working to be able to measure some of the impact of the training and support in terms of also addressing the disposition sheet, that when the private attorneys come to bill the state, that we're actually going to be asking them some education questions saying, did you do this? One is a trigger, oh, was I supposed to do that? And also, you know, to be able to measure what's going on. So it's also been a learning experience in terms of the level of support needed. One of the things we're trying to do is not just the term spray and pray, right? Like, I'm going to give you all this knowledge and I'm just going to pray you're going to use it. But really actually doing supportive mentoring with people so that we can help them to do the education advocacy the first time they do it, so that they learn to do it and have a good experience and see the impact both in school and on the legal outcomes.
Thanks. Let me add one thing that I think is a little bit of a gap in the presentation, just to, not to answer my own question, but just very quickly. There's a lot of litigation that's gone on around segregation. Prisoners Legal Services has obdurately, in the face of obdurate opposition, continued to litigate and enforce a set of regulations that actually would limit the use of solitary confinement if they were ever actually complied with. But I think the concentric circle is narrowing, and that there has been some positive impact there. MHLAC is working with PLS to try to bring some of the positive changes to jails, which have been untouched by any concern about solitary confinement in general, and some worse than others. We're currently suing the Bristol County House of Correction and our favorite sheriff over there.
I just want to answer the question about Massachusetts, because Santa, Fidel, and great advocates in Massachusetts helped enact a law that now requires all school resource officers to have a minimum training in key topics that we infiltrated the bill with. But the key thing here, though, is who's going to do it, and will it be paid for? And there's a funding mechanism now in a state that has really underfunded police training, so it's been justice by geography about who could get their officers trained. But it is going to take a lot of advocacy to make sure skilled professionals conduct these trainings.
Okay, sorry. Let's go to the microphones. You want to start?
Sure. I'm really interested in all of these topics, so thank you very much for all of the contributions today. I come at this from a social work lens, where I've done both policy work and individual psychotherapy, much of which was with youth of color. I'm also come at this from, I'm recently transplanted from New York City. I was there for the past 10 years, and I worked at the largest victim services organization in the country, Safe Horizon. And I think that from what I'm hearing is that or sort of understanding from this conference is that systems can cause and sort of like perpetuate the mental health and trauma symptoms that we are trying to prevent through social services oftentimes. So what I'm thinking and wondering about, I can share my experience from New York very briefly, is that I was a domestic violence shelter director. I both provided mental health counseling individually and developed policy and procedure around mental health training in the city. And something that I did notice is that there are a couple of main barriers to folks, particularly low-income people of color, accessing mental health treatment. Those things that I thought of were having so much distrust for the systems of mental health care because they're sort of viewed as like the police, or we're going to take away your children, right? And so that being said, we have a lot of systems in place to sort of think differently about how we do our work. We place an advocate in every single precinct in New York City, so the advocate can sort of be there to support a person who was just arrested through the process and provide services. So in my work, I noticed a lot of clients that I worked with had zero interest in engaging in mental health treatment. So how do we make the social services that we have more accessible to people that need it the most and stop sort of like perpetuating trauma that is happening from the systems?
Well, I think that's what we're going to be talking about in our groups in a little while. Does anyone have a short hit on that, answering that question?
From my viewpoint, right, the people that I know, they want their services because they need their medication, right? Especially people that I know that are coming out of solitary. Mm-hmm. One of the things that they say is they really need their mass health. They need to be hooked up with services because a lot of them come out dependent on certain meds. Mm-hmm. And if they can't get those meds, they can't function. So that goes along with getting their mental health treatment. They might balk about going to the therapist and the doctors, but they need their treatment. So I know a lot of people that are on medication, and whether it's getting them high or whatever, or keeping them sane or what, or they're smoking marijuana, they're going to see their doctors. Now there may be people that statistically, like you say, that don't want to be hooked up with that, but from people that I know, they're dependent on a lot of meds. That's just...
I wanted to just break in, thank you. So many in our community have such stigma already. And when you're looking at people of color, youth of color, to add the added stigma of mental health, if there's addictions, a trauma, I mean, these things compound each other. Mm-hmm. And one person in our group said, I would rather be known as an addict than known to be having a mental health condition. Mm-hmm. What we're finding is if we can couch the help in forms that people are attracted to without the labels, using human experience language, for instance, instead of saying, oh, that person's depressive or bipolar, or they have this or that, to put it in language, everyday language that people can relate to, really helps.
That's deep.
I just want to say that's Valeria Chambers from our panel yesterday afternoon. For those of you who may not have been here, she's with the Transformation Center, certified peer specialist as well.
Right, so with authority behind what you say. Let's go to June, and then Laura, and then we'll come back to the fellow in the green sweater who didn't get to ask this question last time, so I think.
So I'm not,
Anyway,
I'm not sure
June,
exactly which question to respond to because I want to respond to all of them. So the clinician who just asked the question from New York, I think the easy answer is that we don't provide services that are responsive to people's needs, and we need to do a better job of engaging the communities that we're trying to engage. So, no offense to, I'm a lawyer, no offense to the clinicians who I've worked with for 40 years in these systems, but clinicians need to get off their asses and get out in the communities and engage people. You can't sit in an office and expect that somebody's going to have transportation, insurance, show up to your office on time, and sit there for 50 minutes and be able to, organize themselves enough to actually talk about what their issues are. People are complex and they span all kinds of systems. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are buckets of money all over this country. As long as we have an Affordable Care Act, when people are in jails and prisons, we cannot get federal reimbursement, FFP it's called, federal whatever it's called, FFP. We can't get federal reimbursement for any behavioral health services or medical services in jails and prisons. That all falls to our state and local taxes. As soon as someone is out of jail or prison, we can get 90 cents on a dollar under Obamacare for the first couple of years for supported housing, for transportation. New York City has something called the Brooklyn Health Home, through Maimonides Hospital, where they do in-reach on Rikers Island. They meet people before they're going to get released to the street. They provide transportation, housing, culturally competent services, and New York City's getting 90 cents on a dollar back from the feds for these services. So the money is there. We know how to treat people. There's a total disconnect between the incredible amounts of money we're spending on criminal justice. In most states, much more than we're spending on higher education. New York City, $140,000 a year to keep someone in a cage on Rikers Island. Here, it's $55,000 to $60,000 a year, unless you have a mental illness or substance use disorder, when it goes up to $125,000 a year, fully paid by our state and local tax dollars. Imagine the kinds of, we could build a house for someone and bring all the services to them with that amount of money. So it's really about educating people across systems, and it's incumbent upon all of us to be boundary spanners and connect these dots. That's one issue. Could I keep going?
We're talking here. June was somebody I thought about putting on this panel. She's so this is like instead of that. She's the director of criminal justice program at the National Association for Mental Illness. So one more thing.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about is crisis intervention team training for police officers and other workforces, including correction officers, court personnel, people who work in public libraries, campus police. The research, somebody asked about the research. The research shows that when you train adults, you look at changes in knowledge, attitude, and behavior. And we are finding that with a 40-hour interactive program of crisis intervention team training, where ideally you're getting volunteer officers who really want to work on these issues, and they want to be special responders. So when that so-called EDP, which is what the police still call emotionally disturbed persons call, comes into 911, there's always going to be someone on 24/7 that's going to be a special responder, even if your police department only has 5 officers. So the gold standard is to train 25% of your force in 40-hour training and then do advanced trainings like the kind of training that Lisa does. What we're finding is increased knowledge, decreased stigma, less fear among these particularly young officers when they're responding to mental health calls and behavioral health calls. More officers' self-efficacy, meaning they feel more empowered when they go to the call, so they feel calmer. They're able, a lot of what we teach on de-escalation is really what all of our mothers told us when we got upset, which is take 10 deep breaths, use your inside voice, calm down, take some time, slow it down. What they're taught in the academy is, what we see on TV, big voices, command presence, and jump in. So I think it's really working. The use of force is down. The unnecessary arrests are down. The violence against the community is down, and the officer injuries are down, and trauma on both sides to officers. We're really, seeing this as a gateway to officer self-care. Because if an officer is drinking too much, going home, being mean to his wife and kids, how's he going to be with that hangover in the morning when he's responding to our communities? So officer self-care is a big piece of what we do. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Unexpected bonus. Laura, let's just take questions from the few people who are still online, and then we'll go to our groups.
Okay, so quickly, first off, thanks so much for all the work that all your organizations are doing. Marlies, I was particularly impressed about the way that you're perceiving and working on this linkage between the criminal justice or juvenile justice system and the civil institution of the schools, and the way that the failure of one sort of leads kids down the path to the other. And I think of schools as being one sort of coercive institution where kids have to spend a lot of their time, and so kids who are subject to sort of heightened scrutiny because of mental health issues, because they're youth of color, et cetera, they wind up being subject to a lot more coercive power in those contexts. Thinking more broadly, then I work a lot in housing and homelessness, and a lot of my clients find themselves in civil institutions where they are interacting on a daily basis and under the control of people who do in shelters and housing authorities, et cetera, who are not trained in trauma-sensitive practices, who are not trained in mental health techniques, and that lack of training and the lack of understanding of how to respond to someone who's having a mental health episode can have catastrophic consequences for families. So I'm wondering if any of your institutions are doing work with other institutions that also have immense power over the lives of people who are living in low-income communities, people of color who are confronting mental health issues that are experiencing this kind of punitive response from DTA, from DCF, from their housing authority, et cetera, to try to train those workers in order to mitigate the impacts on people with mental health conditions.
I think Lisa perked up.
So I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's not fair to assume it's just police. And Massachusetts has a trauma education initiative through the Mass Advocacy Center for Children for teachers. We often found the teachers would be trained but not the administrators, or the teachers would be trained and not the SROs who work with them and are calling the kids out. So yes, but no. But secondly, we are seeing some interesting models across the country. Philadelphia has a network of trauma-informed treatment centers for youth. And those are truly professional folks who can provide true trauma care. They work directly with the public schools of Philadelphia. The other thing that we're doing is, the other thing we see is in Cleveland, the Beechwood Services program goes out to the community to provide its mental health services. And that reminds me of two other things we're doing, which is parenting the teen brain to try and bring trauma-informed awareness to parents, as well as understanding of the normative teen brain, and training prosecutors and defense attorneys in trauma and mental health issues generally.
Anyone else? Sir.
Thank you very much. I come at this from a different perspective. I'm not inside the system. I'm outside the system. I'm a 69-year-old disabled person, disabled all my life. And so I've always looked at things from the point of view of the person who has to suffer from the inadequacies of the system. In my case, it was not being educated. So I come at this as an outsider and as somebody who comes here to educate myself and also to share with people the advocacy and the activism, which I appreciate all of the people up there that do this. And I'd like to say hello, Ms. Bensahih. It's been a while since we saw each other at the State House lobbying around criminal justice reform. I appreciate all you do. My question regards two things, real short, because I know we're short on time. The issue of solitary confinement, I was arrested for doing civil disobedience, and I spent 2.5 hours in a jail cell, and I was not happy. I was very, very traumatized by just being in solitary confinement for 2 hours. So as an outsider, not a person who's inside the system, I consider solitary confinement as torture. The issue of torture has been raised in this state with the use of aversives and shock therapy at the Judge Rottenberg Center in Canton, Massachusetts, where I and 200 other disability activists went to in 2016, where we tried to raise the issue to try to get the Judge Rottenberg Center to stop what they're doing with the use of drugs and electric shock treatment against young people, especially people of color and people with disabilities, to change their behavior. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you help us finish this last segment?
I hope so. This ties in somewhat with what we talked about yesterday about people calling. I'm sorry. Is this close enough? Yeah. This ties in somewhat yesterday with what we talked about with people, usually white people, calling the police for stupid reasons on Black people in every day. So I want to know, I guess it's more directed toward Lisa and Marlies, what's being done to educate and or punish teachers and administrators for calling police for stupid reasons instead of being able to conduct their classroom and their school and discipline children, which is their job.
I don't have a good answer for that. So I'm going to start by saying that. I think, especially in schools, it's really difficult to address some of those things that happen because there is a power dynamic just in general where teachers and administrators have the authority, and our laws give them the authority to make referrals, to bring situations to their administration. And there isn't, I think unless you can show in a situation that there is specific discrimination in how this situation was handled, it's very hard to get those kind of responses because there's also confidentiality of student records and things that come up. So I don't, in some ways, think that the legal community kind of jumping in is the answer to that. I think part of the answer to that is teacher peer-to-peer training and supports. It's the schools that are doing this well talking to the schools that aren't doing this well. I think those kind of networks and things that are happening are more, in some sense, a better response because they're going to have access to that, and those conversations are going to happen at that level that wouldn't happen, I think, at you've got to do this, because I think that will close up all the information.
I would have to agree that not much is happening. But when we're asked to look at lawsuits involving school resource officers, we will only talk to attorneys if they will listen to us that we ask schools be made defendants in the case. Because we said, you're putting police in this untenable position, often at the direction of school administrators or teachers, who are completely unregulated. So part of my frustration with the discussion of school resource officers and the harm they do in schools is the absence of discussion of how administrators and teachers use them, and the absence of policies that determine when they may invoke law enforcement, because that ought to be as regulated as what officers do, and it is not. Which is why when we worked with MLAC and SANA on the model MOU with the State Attorney General's office, we strongly recommended an operational manual in which there's cross-training between SROs, teachers, and administrators that would be mandatory. Because when we do our SRO trainings, the administrators, the teachers, I mean, this happened at Boston Public Schools, they refuse to attend, and they get away with refusing to attend. And routinely, SROs tell us they're fighting with teachers saying, no, I'm not going to arrest this kid. They haven't violated any law. That's usually a pretext for arrest. Not always, but they just will not adhere to that. And SROs are extremely angry about it. So I think when we call for school-based reforms, we must also recognize that it's SROs often being commanded and acting between a rock and a hard place in some situations, which they don't always have the legal power to reject the pressures of or coercion of the school principal and teachers who the principal's often protecting.
I mean, I would just add, as somebody who's done this work for a really long time, that people that operate with impunity, when they are called to account, it has an impact on them. They don't like it. Okay.
And that's why we argue they be made defendants, because some of those suits can make you get up and get anxious. And we've seen this in states like New Mexico, another one I'm not going to disclose in the Midwest. You have to hold them to account, and that's why you have to even out this discussion about SROs so that the schools are on notice.
I also just want to add one thing on that I think part of the issue too is we've got a pretty big difference between some of the populations of kids and who's teaching them, right? And that needs to be addressed too. And that's again, I mean, I think this is again an area where there's room for lots of different ways in. There's the lots, but I also think we've got to do better in terms of kids being taught by teachers that look like them.
And resources in those schools. If you want to see the demolition of a public system, look what we've done to public education in the United States, especially in areas where public education is not equally funded by real estate taxes, and you see the resulting lack of resources in those schools. Look at Brookline for a second. Brookline, if a kid gets in trouble, they're assigned a student advocate. Damn. I wish I'd had one in high school, And do you think that's happening in the Boston Public Schools?
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's have a hand for our panelists.